The neighborhood was old, not falling apart, not shining new, just worn the way a good leather belt wears out, tight, creased, and reliable. Brooklyn in the 1940s was a place where kids didn't dream of college. They dreamed of respect, a name, fear. Carmine John Persico was just a boy then. Skinny, sharp eyes, the kind of quiet that made older men pause before raising their voice. His father was a longshoreman, broke most of the time, tired all the time. The docks didn't pay in cash. They paid in exhaustion, in broken backs and bottle caps pressed into palms by shaking fingers. But Carmine watched and waited. He saw the men in suits, not Wall Street types, but real men. Thick hands, thick necks, loud mouths. They parked their Buicks and Lincolns like kings in a peasant town. The cops didn't look at them. The neighbors didn't ask questions. Their hair slicked back like oil over steel. Their rings heavy like guilt. Carmine didn't need a teacher. The streets were a classroom, and he learned fast. By the time he was 15, he was already doing small jobs for the local crew. A message here, a warning there. Sometimes a brick through a window, sometimes worse. He wasn't scared. Not because he was brave, but because he understood one thing early. Fear keeps the small men small. I'm not staying small. They called him the Snake early on, not because he was sneaky, but because he struck quick and left no second chances. You disrespected him once, you didn't get to do it twice. There was a fight once. A kid from down the block said something about Carmine's mother. Nobody remembers what. Carmine didn't argue. He just waited 2 days, followed the kid after school, and put him in the hospital with a lead pipe. Said nothing. Not to the cops, not to his friends. Just sat at the dinner table like nothing happened. His mother asked, "What's on your hands?" "Paint," he said. "Blood smells different." And that day, Carmine decided that the world listens better when your hands aren't clean. He didn't want attention. That was for loudmouths who got clipped before 25. Carmine wanted power, the kind that doesn't come from a gun, but from knowing who pulls the strings. In the 50s, he got made, quietly, no parade, just a nod. He joined the Colombo family, back then still called the Profazzi crew. Carmine kept his mouth shut, kept his blade sharp, and started climbing. Slowly, patiently, like a snake through the grass. And the higher he went, the more he understood something most wise guys didn't. You don't need to be free to run the streets. You just need to own the men who do. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First came betrayal, blood, bosses who disappeared in the night, and war. The war didn't start with gunfire. It started with whispers, cold, quiet whispers in diners, back rooms, and funeral homes. That's how it always starts in the life. You don't hear the first shot until someone's already dead, and by then, the lines are drawn. Carmine wasn't a boss yet, not even close, but he had a way of being in the right place, hearing the wrong things. The Profazzi family was cracking from the inside. Joe Profazzi, the old-school Don, rich from church scams and olive oil rackets, had gotten greedy. He taxed his men like they were his sons-in-law, took more than his cut, way more. When guys brought in $1,000, Profazzi wanted 900 of it, left crumbs for the earners. The men below started to boil. One of them, a tough guy named Joe Gallo, had fire in his gut and no patience in his bones. Gallo and his brothers didn't like being robbed by their own boss, so they started talking. And then they started plotting. Carmine listened. He was still low in the ranks, but not so low that he didn't know the players. The Gallo brothers were reckless. They wanted change, yeah, but they wanted it loud. Carmine didn't want change. He wanted control. And war was a perfect storm for a man like him. The split came fast. Gallo and his crew kidnapped 4 top men in the family, made their point, said they weren't taking Profazzi's abuse anymore. They expected him to fold. He didn't. Profazzi responded the way bosses do when pride is worth more than peace. He lied, smiled, shook hands, and then started killing. One by one, Gallo's guys got clipped. Not in the street, not in big flashy hits. Quiet, cold, calculated. Carmine didn't take a side, not openly. He started showing up at both tables, smiling at both captains, pouring drinks, lighting cigars, nodding like a loyal soldier. But inside, he was already choosing. He knew Profazzi was old. He knew Gallo was wild. Neither of them had the patience to see the war through. One would die, the other would disappear. And in the smoke that followed, Carmine would rise. He played the long game. He ran messages. He arranged meetings that turned into betrayals. He passed information that bought him favors on both ends. When bodies dropped, he was never near. When bullets flew, he was always just out of town. In '62, Profazzi died of cancer. Natural causes, a rare thing in the life, but it left a vacuum. The family named a new boss, Joe Magliocco, just as greedy, just as crooked. Gallo tried to stand tall, but he got pinched, hit with time, out of the game. And suddenly, Carmine's silence became valuable. He wasn't loud like Gallo, he wasn't rich like Magliocco, but he had trust, respect. He didn't demand it, he earned it, with discipline, with work, and with fear. He'd been the guy who handled things, quietly. When a loan shark needed reminding, Carmine sent the reminder. When a union rep needed a push, Carmine made sure he slipped. He wasn't just muscle, he was management material. In '63, Magliocco got greedy and tried to hit bosses from the other families. That plan failed, big time, and Magliocco got pushed aside. That's when the Colombo name was born. Joe Colombo, a boss picked by the commission, not by blood or tradition, stepped into power. A young face, media-friendly, clean-cut for a gangster. He didn't know it yet, but he was just a placeholder, because Carmine was watching, waiting, coiled in the shadows like a snake in the grass. He started taking over the streets from the inside, not through shootouts, through books, numbers, labor. He tied himself to the unions like an anchor to a ship, controlled the waterfront, the construction sites, the trucks. If a brick got laid in Brooklyn, Carmine got paid. He dressed sharp, but he didn't show off. Gold was for showmen. Carmine wore quiet suits, dark shades, and a face that didn't blink. He married young, kept his family quiet, far from the streets. He didn't bring the life home. That wasn't love, it was tactics. Weak men let their enemies know where their kids slept. Carmine made sure nobody even knew what block he lived on. In '71, Gallo got out of prison, thought the war was still on, thought he could come back and take what he lost. He was wrong. He walked into Umberto's clam house one night with a smile and walked out in a body bag. 13 bullets in the back of the head, and nobody saw a thing. The message was clear. Carmine was boss now. Colombo still wore the crown, technically. But after Joe Colombo got shot in the head at a public rally and lived, half dead and drooling for years, Carmine stepped out of the shadows. Nobody challenged him. They knew better. He wasn't loud. He wasn't showy. But he was ruthless and smart. He understood the system and how to twist it until it begged. He didn't just run the family. He transformed it. Every union job, every trucking route, every construction bid, it all flowed through the Colombo family. And the Colombo family flowed through Carmine. He kept the streets clean of unnecessary blood. Murders were surgical now, not messy. And most times, a threat from Carmine was enough to make men vanish on their own. No need for guns when fear handled the job, but no king stays untouched forever. By the late '70s, the feds were breathing down his neck. Surveillance got smarter, rats got louder, and the streets, they started changing. Carmine didn't care. He was old school, built to last, even if the world wanted him gone. In 1986, they got him. RICO charges, federal hammer, full swing. They accused him of murder, extortion, loan sharking, the whole deck. They thought they'd locked him down. They didn't know who they were dealing with. From prison, Carmine didn't just survive. He ran everything. He called the shots, gave orders, appointed street bosses. Messages went out through lawyers, visitors, bent guards. Nothing moved without his say. He controlled the Colombo family from behind bars for decades. He appointed acting bosses, then pulled them when they got weak. He ordered hits. He settled scores. And he never apologized. Prison didn't break him. It only proved what he always believed. Power doesn't come from where you stand. Power comes from who listens when you speak. And they all listened, even his enemies. He aged like stone, quiet, still, deadly. And by the time the 2000s rolled around, Carmine, the snake Persico, wasn't just a mob boss. He was a myth, a man who rose from the gutters of Brooklyn, outlasted 2 civil wars, dodged death more times than most people blink, and ruled a criminal empire from a cage. He didn't sleep easy. No man like that ever does. The blood stays in your dreams. The faces don't fade. Every favor costs something. Every dollar buys another ghost. But sleep or not, Carmine never stopped moving. The snake stayed coiled, waiting. And he would until his last breath. In prison, time works differently. For regular men, it drags, like every hour is an insult. Every day, a reminder that the world has moved on without them. But Carmine, the snake Persico, didn't measure time like a prisoner. He measured it like a king in exile. By the time he got locked up at Lompoc Federal Prison in California in 1987, he was already 70 years old. Most men would have folded. But Carmine wasn't most men. He planned for prison, had already structured the family in such a way that being on the outside wasn't a requirement to rule, and he made sure everyone knew it. The courtroom where they sentenced him to 139 years was cold, but his stare never shook. The judge spoke like he was delivering an ending. Carmine listened like he was reading a forecast he didn't care about. Rain comes, wind blows, the snake stays still. When he got into Lompoc, the guards didn't treat him like a thug. They treated him like a legend. Not a celebrity. Those guys fade. No, Carmine had weight. The kind of presence you don't talk loud around. He kept quiet. Watched the walls, memorized the guards, understood who moved the food, who passed the phones, who ran the cell block politics. In less than 6 months, he'd mapped out how to get his orders out. Letters, visits, lawyers, even old-school smuggled notes. He didn't need to yell. He had soldiers for that. His nephew, Alphonse Alley Boy Persico, handled things on the street. He wasn't Carmine, not even close. But he had the blood, and for a while, that was enough. Carmine appointed acting bosses, men he trusted, or at least thought he could control, to run the Colombo family on the outside. But none of them lasted. They either got too greedy, too weak, or too dead. Vic Orena was one of them, a street guy with ambition bigger than his brain. Carmine made him acting boss in the late 80s. It should have been temporary, just a placeholder until his son or nephew stepped up. But Orena didn't like being second. He started making moves, trying to turn the title acting into permanent. That's when Carmine reminded the world why they called him the Snake. Even from a prison cell, he saw it coming. He had eyes everywhere, not just wise guys, but civilians, union guys, even lawyers who owed favors. Orena thought he was building a loyal following. He didn't know most of his crew still sent word back to Carmine. In 1991, the order came. Simple, cold. Handle it. And just like that, the Colombo Civil War exploded. The streets of Brooklyn turned into a war zone. Daylight shootings, car bombs, front-page headlines. You couldn't eat a slice of pizza without hearing about another Colombo soldier getting clipped. Over 10 men dead, more wounded. And all because one man in a prison cell had decided his authority was not up for discussion. He didn't raise a gun. He didn't leave his cell. But every bullet that flew had his name carved into it. The feds were baffled. How was a man serving life still orchestrating murders, still managing finances, still running labor rackets? They thought locking him up would neutralize him. Instead, they'd given him the perfect throne. No street cops watching him, no wiretaps in his car, no eyes on him at diners or social clubs. Behind bars, he was untouchable. If you wanted to charge him, you had to prove the chain. Prove that what a street guy did could be tied back to this 70-year-old man reading a newspaper in a federal facility. They never could. And Carmine knew it. The Orena faction got crushed, slowly, methodically. Not in one big sweep, but like an infection getting treated one knife at a time. And Carmine? He sat back and watched. He didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. He just restructured, made sure everyone now understood what it meant to test his power. His nephew, Alley Boy, stepped up, took a bigger role, trying to prove he had the iron blood. And for a while, it worked. The Colombos stabilized. Money started flowing again. Union deals got back on track. The family kept its seat at the commission table. But peace never lasts in the life. The feds never stopped watching, never stopped listening. And eventually, they caught Alley Boy too, hit him with murder charges. A body dropped back in the 90s came back to haunt them. The witness flipped, the evidence lined up, and just like that, another Persico was gone from the streets. But Carmine didn't panic. He never panicked. He adjusted, appointed another acting boss, then another. He played the game like chess, always 3 moves ahead, never emotional, never rushed. The men he appointed started to become more like proxies, just faces on the outside that did what he wanted. Some obeyed, some drifted. But no one ever got too comfortable, because Carmine always found a way to remind them who ran things. Even as he aged, his hair turning white, his walk slower, his hands stiffer, his mind stayed razor sharp. He remembered debts, faces, slights. And his memory was longer than the streets. You'd see him during visits sitting there with a calm, dry stare, no flash, no fake smiles. He didn't pretend to be a victim, didn't cry about being wronged. He was a gangster, through and through. But he'd also talk about philosophy, about old books, about Roman emperors and the fall of the Republic. He'd quote Marcus Aurelius like a professor, then give an order that led to a man getting his teeth kicked in 2 states over. Because Carmine never saw crime as chaos. He saw it as structure, a system, a legacy. He didn't run the streets for money, not after a certain point. He ran them for control, for the name, for the fact that when you said the snake, even under your breath, you looked over your shoulder. There were rules, sure, but only the ones he made. Even the other families, Gambinos, Lucchese's, Genovese, they all knew Carmine's reach didn't end at a prison gate. He had influence in prisons across the country, had guys on the inside who owed him, had ex-cons on the outside who still answered the phone when his name was mentioned. He was a godfather with no street corner, no car, no gun, just a voice. And somehow, that was enough. He watched decades pass, watched bosses die, rats talk, guys flip, fortunes fall. He outlived many of them, outlasted the Fed's best attempts. They never broke him, never got a confession, never got a real crack in the armor. His letters were burned after being read. His visitors were clean. His orders came in whispers. Carmine, the snake Persico, had become something even the law couldn't define. A man too powerful to touch, yet already in chains. It bothered them, ate at them, but for him it was just another Tuesday. He didn't get sleep the way normal men did, not deep, not peaceful. He was too old, too carved up inside. But he didn't need rest. Power was its own fuel. And deep inside those walls, surrounded by lifers, junkies, informants, and monsters, Carmine still felt like the calmest man in the room. Because in his mind, the world still turned on his nod. And the moment anyone forgot that, he'd remind them. Time inside didn't make Carmine Persico soft. If anything, it shaved off the unnecessary. The noise, the fake loyalties, the rats pretending to be men, all of it burned away, leaving just the core of who he really was. A warlord in a cage, ruling through silence, memory, and fear. He'd never forget faces. Even after 20 years locked away, he could tell you the exact color of a guy's eyes who once disrespected him in a bar back in the 70s. He remembered how the guy stood, who vouched for him, and how fast he folded when 2 soldiers walked him out back. That was Carmine's gift. Not charm, not speeches, precision. He didn't believe in mistakes, not in the life. A guy skimming money wasn't making an error, he was making a choice. A man talking too much wasn't being careless, he was sending a signal. Carmine watched everything with that in mind. Even behind walls, he treated information like currency. What you knew, what you heard, what you didn't say, all of it could keep you alive, or get you buried. The 90s passed slowly. The headlines about the Mafia started to fade. The public got tired of hearing about old men in tracksuits getting picked up by the FBI. But inside, the war never really ended. It just shifted. Carmine watched as other bosses flipped. Sammy Gravano, Joe Messino, Men who once ruled the streets, now crying into microphones, cutting deals, writing books. It was disgusting. He never spoke their names, just curled his lip whenever they came up. Men with no spine, he once told his lawyer, built a life on blood, then begged for mercy the second it turned on him. But Carmine didn't beg. He served his time like a soldier, never cried foul, never complained to the press. His cell was small, but his influence wasn't. He read, wrote, took care of his body the best he could, ate plain, slept light, never let the guards get too comfortable. He kept a routine, because discipline was how you survived in a world built to break you. When his son, Alphonse Alley Boy Persico, got taken off the streets in the late 90s, Carmine didn't flinch. Alley Boy got popped on murder charges, that same murder tied to William Cutolo, the Colombo underboss who'd gotten too ambitious. Cutolo had been a problem for a while, too flashy, too confident, smiling too wide, the kind of guy who forgot who built the empire he was now strutting through. Carmine saw it long before anyone else. When Cutolo got the offer to take over the family after Arena's civil war collapse, he said yes a little too fast. Carmine didn't like fast. Fast meant greedy, fast meant stupid. Fast meant you thought you were safe, nobody was safe. So when Cutolo disappeared in 1999, Carmine didn't blink, just made sure the message got passed. Things are back in order. It took years for the feds to piece things together. Bones were found in a field in Farmingdale, Long Island. DNA said Cutolo. Alley Boy took the fall. But nobody could prove Carmine gave the order. Of course he did. But that's the point. You couldn't prove it. He was almost 80 now. Other bosses had died of heart attacks or bullets or boredom. Carmine just kept going. Like the last man standing in a burned-out cathedral. He'd outlasted the wars, the rats, the law. The guards gave him space. Even they knew. This wasn't some mugger doing 5 years. This was a man who'd once controlled millions, built unions, orchestrated assassinations, and walked untouched for decades. They didn't treat him like a threat. They treated him like a storm. You don't argue with a storm. You just stay out of its path. Visitors changed over the years. Old friends stopped coming. Some died, some disappeared. Some just got scared. The new guys, younger, sharper, with soft hands and sharp suits, came to pay their respects. Sat across from him with notebooks, lawyers, low voices. Carmine never said much, just watched, measured them. Most of them weren't ready. They wanted the glory without the grind, wanted to be called boss without bleeding for it. He could smell weakness. He didn't even need a full sentence. A blink too long, a laugh too quick, and he knew, this one won't last. But every now and then, one would catch his eye. Someone who moved slow, asked real questions, didn't brag. Carmine would give them a word or two, not advice, just a code, something they could choose to understand or not. The ones who talk loud, die quiet, or don't build what you won't bleed for. Most of them didn't get it. That was fine. He wasn't there to babysit the future. He was there to guard the past. Because what he built mattered, not because of money. Money came and went, but structure, fear, legacy, that lasted. Even in his 80s, Carmine still got letters, requests, old men begging him to settle disputes, younger guys asking for his blessing. His name still opened doors in neighborhoods he hadn't walked through in 40 years. And that meant more than anything. The system had tried everything. Indictments, surveillance, infiltration, flipping soldiers, media smears, RICO. They gave him 139 years hoping he'd fade away. But instead, they watched him become an institution. A man who ran his family longer than any boss in Mafia history. A man who built something from the gutter and never once said sorry for how he did it. They hated that. And he loved that they hated it. In the quiet nights, he'd sit by the small window of his cell, staring out past the bars. The moonlight hit the floor in thin lines. His knuckles were stiff now. Arthritis or age didn't matter. He still clenched his fists the same. Sometimes the guards saw him like that, still, staring, thinking. They wondered what he saw. He wasn't thinking about freedom. He was thinking about that moment years ago when he told himself, "It doesn't matter where I sleep. It matters who doesn't sleep because of me." And even now, even locked up, forgotten by the headlines, replaced by newer criminals with cameras and hashtags, Carmine knew there were still men out there who feared him, men who woke up sweating, men who remembered what it felt like to sit across from him, not knowing if they'd walk out whole, men who made choices because of his name. That's what mattered. Not parole, not mercy, legacy. And that legacy was still breathing, still whispering, still watching. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The older he got, the less he spoke. But somehow his silence said more. Most men shrink with age. Bones give out, memories fade, pride turns into regret. But Carmine didn't shrink. He just sat deeper in his shadow, like a mountain getting older. Still heavy, still immovable. He was past 80 now. Lompoc's walls hadn't changed, neither had the faces much. Just different uniforms, same types. CEOs who tried to be firm but never stupid. Even the dumb ones knew. Carmine Persico wasn't like the others. He wasn't there because he got sloppy. He was there because he played a long game, and even long games need sacrifices. The truth is, he could have flipped a long time ago. They offered, again and again. First quietly, a wink from a prosecutor, a whisper from a federal agent, then more directly. They said they'd cut time, give him better living conditions, maybe even talk parole, though that was bullshit. All he had to do was say a few names, give a little blood. Carmine never even answered. That's what made them furious. The feds didn't hate rats. They hated men who refused to become one. The men who made their lives harder by standing tall. The ones who aged in steel boxes and never gave them the satisfaction. But Carmine didn't do it for pride. Not like people thought. Pride fades when your back aches and your meals are cold and someone younger is telling you when to sleep. No. Carmine stayed silent for something bigger, something colder. Power doesn't forgive betrayal, even if you're dying. A man who built an empire doesn't burn it down just to get a softer pillow. He saw the long arc, he always had. And even as time took his health, it never touched his purpose. Letters still came, requests, reports, coded updates from the street. Not as many as before, not as clear, but they came. The Colombo family was struggling. New York wasn't the same. Rackets had changed. Digital money, surveillance, too many rats. The streets weren't loyal anymore. Guys flipped faster than the ink dried on their indictments. Carmine read it all with that same stillness in his face. Not surprised, just annoyed. He knew it would happen, had warned them. The life gets easier to enter, harder to live, he once said to an acting boss who visited him in 2005. Too many kids want the suit without the scars. That guy got pinched in 18 months. Another weak link in a chain too loose. The younger generation didn't know how to shut up. Everyone wanted to be something. The new John Gotti, the next big name. But they didn't know what it took to keep a family alive for decades. Carmine did. And while others played gangster on social media, he was still controlling the last pieces of a dying empire with nothing but paper, memory, and fear. Once in a while, they'd send in an undercover. You could spot them. Too clean, too curious, too polite, asking the wrong questions with the right tone. Carmine never gave them a damn thing. He'd look them in the eye and say, "You know what I hate most about your kind?" They'd blink. "What's that?" "You always think you're smarter than the people who built the game you're playing." And that would be it. Another wasted operation. His routine didn't change. Wake early. No alarm, just instinct. Morning stretch, slow but consistent. Read whatever books came through. He had a taste for history, Rome, Julius Caesar, Machiavelli, the rise and fall of systems built by hard men, broken by soft ones. There was a lesson in all of it. Power never died from the outside. It rotted from within. That's what was happening to the mob. Too many soft hands, too much ego, not enough loyalty. He'd shake his head sometimes, looking over a report. Names he didn't recognize, guys giving orders without stripes, too young, too loud. The last time he saw his own nephew, Alley Boy, was during a legal meeting in early 2007. By then, Alley was locked up too. Same fate, same blood. They didn't hug, they didn't cry, just a stare. Two iron wills, bent by time but not broken. "You did good," Carmine said after 10 minutes of silence. Allie nodded. "I tried. You stayed loyal. That's what matters." That was the closest thing to love Carmine ever gave. He never believed in softness. Love was for the weak. But loyalty, now that was sacred. That visit stayed with him, longer than most. There was something final about it. Allie would never see the streets again, just like him. And yet, neither man asked for pity. Carmine had made peace with his own legend. He didn't want statues. He didn't care about news specials or documentaries. He wasn't one for fanfare. All he wanted was for the right men to remember, the ones who still ran numbers under fake names, the ones who still had blood on their collars and silence in their lungs, the ones who knew that Carmine Persico didn't die in prison. He ruled in it. As 2010 crept in, his health got worse. The cold got deeper in his bones. Breathing got harder. He moved slower, spoke less, but his eyes, still sharp, still alive. Sometimes when the guards rotated, the new guys would treat him like any other old inmate. They'd talk to him loud or pat him down rough. The older COs would warn them, quietly. "You don't treat that man like a common thug." "Why? He gonna bite me?" "No, he's gonna bury you and it's not gonna make a sound." They laughed. At first. Then one day, one of those young COs, the cocky one, got reassigned. Nobody said why. Nobody ever does. But Carmine smiled for the first time in weeks. Even in chains, his name carried weight. He'd wake up sometimes from dreams he couldn't shake, not nightmares. He never called them that. Just visits from ghosts, old faces, guys he'd lost, men he'd ordered buried, friends, enemies. Some showed up smiling, others just stared. One night he saw Gallo, laughing at a table full of blood. Another night, it was his own father, shaking his head in silence. Once, it was Cutolo. No eyes, just a mouth asking, was it worth it? He'd wake up, palms sweating, breath shallow, but he never regretted, not once. "Worth it?" he'd whisper to himself. "I made them remember my name." And that was the truth of it. The streets forget most men. They move on, get new kings, new rules. But Carmine, the snake Persico, his shadow never left Brooklyn, or Queens, or Staten Island, or the bones of every man who thought he could play the life louder than Carmine played it smarter. And as the nights grew longer, and the world outside forgot what real Cosa Nostra meant, Carmine knew the day would come soon. But he wasn't scared of dying. He was scared of who came after. Because once real men are gone, all that's left is noise. By the time the world turned toward the 2010s, Carmine, the snake Persico, had already become something else. Not just a gangster, not just a prisoner. He was a relic, a remnant of a darker, more disciplined underworld, where loyalty wasn't optional, and a man's word meant more than a wiretap transcript. But even relics can cast long shadows. Carmine was in his early 80s now, still in Lompoc. Same plain walls, same cracked concrete, same tiny window with light that came and went like a visitor that didn't stay long. His bones hurt more. The arthritis in his hands made writing a chore, but he never stopped. He still responded to letters, not many and not fast, but enough to remind certain people out there that the old boss was still watching, still alive. The Colombo family, what was left of it, was barely functioning. Split leadership, too many wannabes, too many microphones hidden in the walls. The old order had been replaced by paranoia, and that made things dangerous. Not dangerous like shootouts in the streets. Those days were mostly over, but dangerous in the quiet way, the kind that meant guys didn't trust their own soldiers, captains didn't know if their right-hand man was wearing a wire. Loyalty was down, ego was up, and guys were getting indicted for things they bragged about on the internet. It was disgusting. Carmine watched it from his tiny cell, shaking his head. He didn't need visitors to know what was happening. The street had its own rhythm. And if you'd lived it long enough, you could feel it shift like weather before a storm. The books weren't getting closed. Gigs were getting sloppy. Young guys were doing things for clout, not cash. And worst of all, nobody was thinking 5 moves ahead. They were playing checkers. Carmine had always played chess. One night in 2013, he got a visit from an old friend, not a gangster, a union guy, retired. Clean now, technically. He sat across from Carmine during visitation and couldn't stop looking at how old he looked. "You're still here," the man said, voice cracking with some strange mix of guilt and admiration. Carmine didn't blink. "Yeah, and you're still alive." That's all it took. Because the old man knew what he meant. You don't stay alive unless I allow it. The power was still there. Diminished, yes, but not dead. Like a lion too old to hunt, but still able to kill with one bite. And Carmine knew it. He didn't need more hits. He didn't need more headlines. He had one thing that mattered more than all of it. Fear that lasted. Guys who had never even met him, kids born in the 90s who only heard his name in whispers, still crossed the street when someone brought him up, still avoided his old haunts, still spoke about him with respect usually reserved for ghosts, because Carmine never let anyone forget what happened to men who betrayed him. That was the difference. Other bosses got taken out. Their legacies diluted. Their soldiers flipped. Their underbosses wrote books, cried on camera. Carmine. He buried anyone who considered betrayal before they could even say the word. He didn't need forgiveness. He didn't need fame. He needed control. But time, even for the strongest men, keeps moving. In 2014, he had a health scare, pneumonia. He ended up in a prison hospital bed for 2 weeks. Tubes, IVs, monitors beeping like alarms with no purpose. He hated it, hated being seen weak, hated not being able to get up, put on his shoes, walk the floor like a man. One nurse made the mistake of treating him like some helpless old man. "You need anything, Mr. Persico?" she asked, sweet voice, fake smile. He stared at her so cold she almost dropped the clipboard. "I need you to never say my name again." That was it. No shouting, no threats, but she never came back. Another nurse took her place, quieter, smarter. Even dying, Carmine commanded respect. Not because he asked for it, because he'd earned it over decades in a world where men died just for being in the wrong room at the wrong time. He recovered, slowly. But his body was telling him something now. It was close. He didn't complain, didn't whine. He accepted it the way a soldier accepts winter. It comes, it freezes everything, and if you're strong enough, you survive. If not, you vanish. He'd survived too long to start fearing it now. But what did haunt him, not at night, not in dreams, but in those long, empty afternoons, was this question: who will remember me right? Not the papers, not the prosecutors who tried to build their careers off his blood, not the rats who survived by destroying what they once swore to protect. He meant the men, the real ones, the few still out there who understood what it cost to build something that lasts, to hold power not with guns, but with fear and precision. He'd outlived so many of them: Gallo, Colombo, Orena, Cutolo, even Messino who flipped, even Gravano who sold his soul for a podcast and an audience. Carmine never needed any of that. He had his silence, and in that silence was dominion. In 2016, a journalist wrote him, asked for an interview, said they were writing a book on the Mafia, said Carmine's story was critical to the history of the 5 families. Carmine had the letter read aloud. He nodded once. "Right back." The guard raised an eyebrow. "You want to talk to him?" "No," Carmine said. He paused. "Tell him the history was written already. He just can't read it." That was the only reply. That book came out 2 years later. Carmine's name barely got 2 paragraphs. The author said he was hard to access and notoriously secretive. Good. That's how it should be. Because the more mysterious you are, the more powerful your legend becomes. And Carmine wasn't trying to be understood. He was trying to be remembered right. His last few years were quiet. Not because nothing was happening, but because he chose it that way. He didn't want more meetings, didn't want new soldiers. The world outside had changed too much. The rules had shifted. The code had holes in it. Guys wanted loyalty and Instagram at the same time. That wasn't his world. So he watched it from a distance, not with sadness, not with anger, just with that same cold stare. Like a king watching a crumbling kingdom, knowing he had ruled it, when it still meant something. Knowing he had walked those streets when blood bought respect and silence meant survival. He wasn't bitter. He was just done talking. The days in prison had lost all shape. Carmine woke without clocks, slept without need. Meals came and went, delivered by faces that looked less like men and more like ghosts in uniforms. The air was colder now, and not just because of the season. It was as if the walls themselves knew something was coming, something final. He wasn't sick, not exactly. Not in the way that doctors write down in charts, but he could feel it. The tiredness was different now, not like sleep, not like boredom. It was a heaviness in the chest, in the eyes, like something waiting to shut off one part at a time. He didn't fight it. That would have been stupid. Carmine Persico didn't fight nature. He simply refused to surrender before it was time. Every day he still followed his ritual. Slow morning, slow walk, careful reading. He didn't get up fast anymore. Not because he couldn't, but because there was no reason to rush. The world wasn't moving without him, not in any meaningful way. The Colombo family still existed, barely. A few rackets still alive, a few names still answering to the structure he built. But Carmine knew the truth. What he'd created wasn't just crumbling, it was fading. No civil war had ever truly destroyed the family. No Fed had ever truly cracked its bones. But time was undefeated. And now, the last living piece of the old world was sitting alone in a cell, thinking not about death, about what comes after it. The men who visited him had changed, fewer now, less useful. Most of the old guard were gone, dead, retired, flipped, or just lost in their own fog. The young guys who came in their place tried to act respectful, brought envelopes, gave status reports, but their eyes were too soft, their hearts too loud. Carmine didn't speak much during those visits. Let them talk, let them ramble. Once in a while he'd lean forward and say just a few words. "You trust this guy?" The visitor would blink. "Yeah, I think so. Then you already made your first mistake." That was the kind of lesson you couldn't learn from books. You had to bleed for it. And Carmine had bled for it more than once. He'd lost soldiers, nephews, friends, all to the same disease, trust given too easily. He wasn't bitter about it anymore, just cold. He'd accepted what he was, not a man, but a myth. And myths don't retire. They just become stories other men whisper when they need courage or fear. He thought a lot about loyalty in those final months, what it really meant, the way it was thrown around like a slogan now. Loyalty to Carmine had never meant flattery. It meant sacrifice. Could you carry out a hit on a man you liked? Could you sit in court with your mouth shut while they painted you like a monster, knowing the real monsters were walking free? Could you die in silence? If you couldn't, you didn't belong near his name. That was what separated him from the rest, even from bosses he once stood next to, Gigante, Godi, Massino. They had presence. Some had flair, some had fear, but Carmine had patience, and patience always won. It's why, even as his body grew weaker, his power held. Because men feared that the old lion, even dying, could still reach out from the grave and settle accounts. He remembered every name, every favor, every betrayal. He didn't need a list. It was in his blood. The guards grew quieter around him now. They used to chat, make comments, whisper after they passed. Now they moved slower, more deliberate, like walking near a dying animal whose claws were still sharp. They didn't say it, but they felt it too. The end. One of them, a younger guard, tried to make small talk. "You ever think about getting out? If they gave you parole or something?" Carmine looked up slowly, like a glacier shifting. "I got out years ago," he said. The guard furrowed his brow. "But you've been here since..." "I didn't say I walked out. I said I got out." He didn't explain. That was the thing about Persico. He didn't overtalk. Never did. If you didn't understand what he meant, you probably didn't need to. What he meant was this: prison never had him. They had his body, sure, but not his power, not his silence, not his decisions. He'd made peace with the cage long ago, not because he liked it, but because he refused to let it define him. The walls were just walls. His name traveled far beyond them, even now. A week later, he got a letter. Not from an old friend, not from a soldier, but from a kid. 17 years old. Said he'd heard about the snake from his uncle. Said he wanted to know how to be strong. Carmine didn't smile, but he read that letter 3 times. Then he wrote back. No long message, just one line. Strength is not in how you act when they fear you, but how you wait when they forget you. He didn't expect a response, didn't need one. That was his gift now, leaving marks quietly. One morning, in January 2019, the air felt heavy. He didn't get out of bed. The COs found him breathing slow, not struggling, just still. Eyes open, staring at the ceiling like he was reading something only he could see. They took him to the prison infirmary. He said nothing on the way. No pain, no complaints, just silence. His pulse slowed, his lungs wheezed, then they just stopped. No final speech. No last command, just a whisper between him and whatever force was waiting beyond the concrete walls. Carmine Persico died the same way he lived, quietly, deliberately, and on his own terms. They didn't make a big show of it. No funeral with camera crews, no crowd of tearful men in dark coats, just a small, quiet arrangement. A few close blood relatives. No reporters, no speeches. The kind of goodbye that suits a man who never wanted a spotlight. Just a seat at the table where powers passed, not paraded. Somewhere, in the back alleys of Brooklyn, a few old-timers raised a glass. They didn't say much, just tapped their fingers on the table, once, twice, in silence. For the snake. For the last boss who didn't fold. When a man like Carmine Persico dies, the world doesn't go quiet. It gets louder, not with noise, but with movement. The kind of movement that comes in whispers and sideways glances, like men in a room pretending they're not measuring each other. The snake was gone. For real this time. No second act, no comebacks. And now the streets had to ask one question that no one wanted to say out loud. Who fills his shoes? There was no funeral with a marching band, no crown to hand over, no speech. This wasn't a corporation with a board of directors and a transition plan. This was Cosa Nostra. And when the last real Don dies in a cell, every ambitious son of a bitch who's ever smiled too wide starts making calls. The Colombo family had been shaky for years, held together by memory, fear, and Carmine's quiet influence. But now that glue was gone. No more coded letters, no more indirect warnings, no more sharp, silent eyes reading the chessboard from a concrete coffin. The vacuum didn't wait. Within a week, small meetings started happening all across Brooklyn and Staten Island, in the backs of cafes, construction offices, social clubs, even funeral homes. No official sit-downs, nothing sanctioned. But everyone knew what they were. It was positioning. Everyone had a theory. Some said the family would fracture permanently, 5 captains all claiming their piece. Others whispered that the commission wouldn't let it happen, that one of the other families would send someone to oversee the Colombo remains. But the worst theory, the one no one wanted to believe, was the one that started spreading like a sickness. Maybe the Colombo family is finished. That wasn't just a sentence. That was a threat to legacy. You see, when a boss dies in prison after ruling for over 30 years, not by bullets, not by betrayal, but by time, and no one's strong enough to take his place, then every rival boss starts circling. Not because they want to destroy what he built, but because they want to steal the bones and rebuild it in their name. That's how it works. The streets don't mourn power, they inherit it. There were still Persico loyalists. Men who'd sworn oaths decades ago, guys with old-school values, men who wouldn't let the family's name be swallowed whole by outsiders. But they were fewer now, older, slower, and they didn't have a plan. One of them, Tommy Knotts Leone, tried to organize a sit-down 3 weeks after Carmine's death. Private, just the captains and some trusted consiglières, no young blood, no outsiders. They met in the back room of a bakery in Bensonhurst. The place had been used for family business for 40 years. no cameras, no heat. Tommy sat at the head of the table. His voice was gravel, not from smoking, but from years of holding in things that could get you killed. "Listen," he said, tapping his thumb on the wood. "He's gone. We can cry later. Right now, we need structure. We need one voice." A couple of heads nodded, but one guy, a sharp-dressed, fast-talking capo named Richie Mangano, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "With all due respect, Tom, you saying that voice is yours?" The room went tight. That kind of question doesn't get asked unless you've already chosen your side. Tommy didn't blink. "No, I'm saying it ain't yours." That was the old world clashing with the new. Richie was flashy, young enough to understand the digital world, but still rooted in the life. He ran a crew in Queens that dealt with gambling, fraud, crypto scams, the kind of stuff Carmine never touched. But it made money, and Richie had soldiers. That made him dangerous. The meeting ended with no decision, just glares and tension. Everyone left the room knowing the family had just split in two. Over the next month, things started to unravel. Crews stopped kicking up money. Guys started ignoring orders. Low-level associates began doing freelance jobs, stuff that never would have been tolerated under Carmine. There was no war. Not yet. But there was heat in the air, the kind that comes before someone gets shot in a car that doesn't belong to them. Richie Mangano started moving like a man with purpose, visited old rackets, made phone calls, took meetings he had no business taking. Rumor was, he'd reached out to the Gambinos, asked for support in case things got loud. That alone was enough to get a man killed in the old days. Bringing outsiders into internal family business? Unforgivable. But Richie didn't care. He was playing a different game. He wasn't trying to preserve Carmine's legacy. He was trying to replace it. Meanwhile, in Staten Island, the last real Persico loyalist left on the street, Benny Searcy, a former hitman turned Shylock, was trying to hold the line. Benny was old school. Scar on his neck from a blade fight in the 80s. Didn't talk unless he had to. Didn't laugh unless someone earned it. He called in some favors, gathered what was left of the loyal crews, told them straight, Richie wants to be king, then he's got to bleed for it. But nobody wanted war. Not yet. Not while the feds were still watching the family from every angle. There were bugs everywhere. Guys getting pinched on old charges, court dates popping up like weeds. They all knew that one wrong move and the whole damn thing collapses. So, it was chess, not checkers. And Benny was waiting for the right moment, the right crack, to make his move. Then, in early April, the crack came. A guy named Angelo D'Amico, mid-level earner, former Richie soldier, turned up in a dumpster in Sheepshead Bay. 2 in the chest, 1 in the mouth. Classic message. Somebody had sent a warning, old-school style. Nobody claimed it. Richie didn't flinch. But the whispers started. Maybe Benny isn't waiting anymore. Cops showed up, of course, made noise, interviewed everyone who ever stood next to Angelo at a craps game. But nothing stuck. The body got buried, the fear got louder. And just like that, the war started. But not the kind with shootouts. This war was silent. Crews started pulling back from Richie. Soldiers stopped returning his calls. A few envelopes started going to Benny instead. It wasn't loyalty, not really. It was survival. Richie knew it, and that made him sloppy. He started moving paranoid, watching his own guys, making threats. Even skipped a meeting with the Genovese acting capo, something that pissed off the whole Bronx. Now he had problems on both sides. Benny, meanwhile, did what Persico had always done, said nothing. Just let the weight shift. Let the fear do the work. Let Richie bury himself in his own reflection. And soon enough, Richie disappeared. Not killed, not shot, just vanished. Rumors said he was hiding in Florida. Some said he flipped. Others claimed he'd been taken out by his own crew, quietly, without permission. The ultimate insult. No body, no funeral. Just an absence. And in the world Carmine built, an absence was sometimes more powerful than a bullet. By summer, Benny Searcy had become the unofficial voice of what remained of the Colombo family. He never called himself boss, never wore the crown, but when guys had a question, they called him. When money needed moving, he gave the word. And when a young soldier asked him what the future looked like, Benny said, "It's not about future. It's about finishing what was started." Because deep down, he knew something no one wanted to admit. This was the endgame. Carmine's empire, once a fortress built on fear and loyalty, had become a ruin held together by memory. The guys still on the street, they weren't building something new. They were keeping the lights on, protecting the few pieces left before the system finally folded in on itself. And maybe that's the way it had to end. Not with blood in the streets, not with a king on a throne, but with a whisper fading into the cold wind of a city that no longer needed men like Carmine. But even ruins have weight. And the name Persico still made phones go quiet, still made old men cross themselves in silence, because some legacies don't die when the man does. They die when the last man stops fearing the ghost. And that hadn't happened. Not yet. By the fall of 2019, the word on the street was that the Colombo family, or what was still being called that, was finished. The other families didn't say it out loud. That would have been disrespectful. But they weren't paying the old courtesies anymore. Favors were getting delayed, meetings ignored, envelopes light. And when decisions were made, Benny Cersei was no longer invited to the table. It wasn't war. It wasn't peace. It was worse, irrelevance. And for a man like Benny, who'd spent his life earning his bones under Persico, irrelevance felt like rot. But what could he do? Start a war with no soldiers? Make noise in a city that had moved on from the rules of old Cosa Nostra? The streets were no longer built for men like him. They were built for cliques, surveillance, and broken oaths. Loyalty had been replaced by strategy, strength replaced by publicity. Even the rats had fans now. And Benny? He was stuck holding the crumbling frame of an empire that used to matter, a frame held together by names carved into headstones. He spent his days moving careful, small meetings, trusted circles. He didn't take phones into restaurants, still wore a piece under his jacket, still walked with his back to the wall. Old habits, maybe. Or maybe the instinct never left. He didn't talk about Persico much, but he felt him everywhere. Sometimes when he stood in the back of the old bakery, he'd light a cigarette and remember Carmine's stare, the way he never rushed a decision, the way he made you feel like you didn't really exist unless he allowed you to. There was something terrifying about that kind of quiet power. Now, it was gone. And every two-bit hustler with a crew of 5 thought they could sit in Carmine's old chair, without bleeding for it, without earning it. Benny kept the peace, but only barely. He still had some influence, old-timers who owed him, a few businesses that still paid respect, but every day that passed, his reach shrank. One of his younger guys, a street-level collector named Frankie DeLuca, came to him one night with a problem. "We got some kid down in Flatbush talking reckless," Frankie said. "Said the Colombo name don't mean shit no more. Said he don't gotta pay tax on nothing." Benny looked up from his coffee. "And? I figure we send a little message, right?" Benny stared at him. "You think messages mean anything anymore?" Frankie blinked. I thought maybe..." "Kid," Benny interrupted, "the time for messages ended when the last man who made him stick went cold in a federal bed." Frankie didn't speak after that, but the problem still lingered. The disrespect was growing, not just from kids, but from the neighborhoods. Landlords stopped paying street tax, gambling joints started cutting out the family middlemen, union contacts dried up, even the crooked cops didn't pick up the phone anymore. There were no headlines, no shootouts, just decay. It wasn't just the Colombo family that was dying. It was the whole idea of it. In December, Benny got an unexpected visitor. It was Anthony Persico, Carmine's grandson. He was in his late 30s, not street-made, but not stupid either. Quiet, calm, and dangerously polite, he sat across from Benny in the back of a butcher shop in Diker Heights. "I heard you're holding things together," Anthony said. Benny nodded. "Trying. You think it's worth it?" Benny didn't answer right away. "Your grandfather thought so," he said finally. Anthony leaned back. "My grandfather died behind bars with a failing heart and more ghosts than friends." Benny's eyes narrowed. "You come here to piss on the bones, kid?" Anthony raised a hand. "No." I came because I heard there's still a piece of what he built left, and I'm trying to decide if it's worth saving. Saving? Benny scoffed. It's not a soup kitchen. You don't save a crime family. Anthony's tone didn't change. Then what do you do with it? Benny leaned in. You earn it, one beating, one bullet, one decision at a time. This ain't a game. You don't inherit this life like it's a house in Jersey. Anthony nodded slowly. I'm not looking to inherit. I'm looking to rebuild. The silence after that was heavy, like the room itself was trying to remember a time when those words meant something. You got men? Benny asked. A few? Money? Enough. Blood? Anthony held his stare. Do you have to ask? That was when Benny saw it. The real thing. The thing so many guys lacked. Conviction, not ego, not noise. Just that cold certainty that comes from knowing who you are and being ready to die for it. For the first time in months, Benny felt something like a pulse under the ashes. Maybe there was a future after all. Over the next few weeks, things started moving. Quietly. Anthony didn't make a big splash. No announcements, no handshakes with made guys in diners. He started small. Meetings with old contacts, quiet visits to businesses that used to kick up. Respectful, but firm. He wasn't there to ask permission. He was there to reignite fear. And fear, it turned out, still remembered the name Persico. One by one, old loyalties reemerged. Not strong, but real. A guy who owned a portside warehouse in Red Hook started passing envelopes again. A former bookmaker who went cold for years reached out, asking about arrangements. Anthony handled it all with surgical precision. He didn't ask for titles, didn't wear the crown. He let Benny stay out front, take the calls, nod at the meetings. But the orders? They came from him. And slowly, the Colombo name began to breathe again. Not like before. Not like the 80s or 90s, but like a heartbeat buried under concrete, still alive. Then came the test. A new player moved in from Jersey. Young crew, Russian-backed, pushing into Brooklyn real estate scams. They didn't care about legacy, didn't recognize the 5 families. They saw vacuum, and vacuum meant opportunity. They tried to strong-arm a laundromat on 18th Avenue that paid quiet tax to Benny for years. The owner called Benny the same night. 2 days later, Anthony showed up. He walked in alone. No soldiers, no brass knuckles, just a calm face and a history you could feel. The Russians didn't respect him, at first. Then one of them said something about Carmine, something stupid, something about dinosaurs and dead men in prison. Anthony didn't flinch. He just said, "You ever wonder what happens when you wake up a ghost that was better left sleeping?" Nobody understood the line, until the next morning when the guy who mouthed off turned up on the side of the Belt Parkway with his kneecap shattered and a rat's tail sewn into his mouth. Old school, ugly, loud. The message landed. And just like that, the Persico name mattered again. It wasn't resurrection. It wasn't revolution. It was continuation. A slow, steady hand reaching through the dirt and reminding everyone that some legacies don't stay buried. Benny knew he wouldn't live to see it fully rebuild. His heart was slowing. His body ached. He wasn't afraid. He'd served. He'd stayed loyal. He'd outlived most of the men who ever called him by his first name. But in Anthony, he saw a flicker of the old world, not a clone of Carmine, but a reminder. And that was enough. One night, in the back of that same butcher shop, Benny raised a glass with Anthony. To him, Benny said. To the last boss who never bent. Anthony didn't clink the glass. He just stared down at the liquor. No, he said. To the man who taught me never to kneel. The first time Anthony Persico ordered a hit, he didn't blink. It wasn't a decision made in anger. It wasn't even personal. It was necessary. That's what separated him from the amateurs. Guys on the street did things because of ego, because someone stepped on their toes, or looked at them the wrong way in a restaurant. Anthony learned early from stories his grandfather never told, only lived through, that real power doesn't move until it has to. But when it does, it doesn't apologize. The target was a mid-level guy in the Bronx, a former Colombo associate turned freelancer, Started running his own books, using the family's old union contacts without kicking anything up. When confronted, he brushed it off like it was ancient history. "I ain't worked under Persico in years," he said. "That name don't mean much no more." That was the moment he signed his death slip. Anthony didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just left the table. And 3 nights later, the guy was found slumped over his steering wheel outside his girlfriend's apartment, single shot, clean behind the ear, wallet left untouched. The message wasn't just for the corpse, it was for everyone else thinking the Colombo family was a museum exhibit. Carmine's shadow had found a new shape. Within weeks, the streets were buzzing again, not loud, but alert. Guys who had gone quiet started reaching out. Old bookmakers wanted protection again. Crews in Brooklyn that had drifted toward the Albanians suddenly remembered who used to run Bay Ridge. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. The kind that only comes when men realize a name they thought was gone still carries weight and teeth. But this wasn't the 1980s. Anthony wasn't dealing with neighborhood respect and newspaper headlines. He was dealing with tech money, cybercrime, and younger guys who'd never stepped foot in a social club. Still, he adapted fast. That was his edge. He didn't try to act like his grandfather. He didn't dress in double-breasted suits or chain smoke over espresso in old diners. He wore clean slacks, plain jackets, no rings. He moved like a ghost in a tailored coat. He didn't talk about the life. He lived it, quietly, surgically, with purpose. And most importantly, he listened. That's what Carmine had done better than anyone. Better than Gotti, better than the flashier dons who loved the cameras. Carmine had listened to the wind before the storm, read the room before the war, and Anthony learned that same rhythm. He wasn't trying to make the Colombo family feared again. He was trying to make it relevant. And relevance in this new world wasn't about bodies and trunks. It was about leverage. He started small. Bought a car dealership in Staten Island under a dummy name. The place didn't make big profit, but it cleaned dirty money with no questions asked. Then he moved into waste disposal. Classic, reliable, and still tied to union hands that remembered the old days. He didn't demand anything, just visited, made introductions, let them know the last Persico on the map wasn't playing boss. He was the boss, and he didn't need them to believe it. He just needed them to act like it. And they did. Then came the docks. A container ship company that had ties to Russian money was trying to squeeze out the last few Colombo-tied businesses from the Brooklyn port. No guns, just lawsuits, permits, political donations. Anthony knew the game. He'd studied it while his grandfather rotted in prison, and he knew what power looked like in a suit with a law degree. So he adapted. He reached out to a former district attorney turned fixer, a guy who once tried to indict Persico back in the late 2000s and lost. He bought him, not with cash, with secrets. And when the Russian-backed companies stopped getting permits and started getting audited, the message was clear. The Colombo family wasn't just back, it had evolved. But with growth came new problems. A young crew from Flatlands, loosely tied to the Lucchese's, started skimming off a gambling app tied to one of Anthony's new digital fronts. They thought they were being slick, thought he wouldn't notice. He noticed, but he didn't retaliate the way Carmine would have. Carmine would have buried them in a ditch behind a truck yard. Anthony? He bought the app they were skimming from, rerouted their funds, and sent a bottle of whiskey to their captain with a note that read, "That was your free one." They got the message, because only a man with real power can flex without firing. Benny watched all of it from the side. He'd become more of a relic now, no longer in the field, but still respected. Still kissed on the cheek. Still called Uncle Benny even by guys who didn't know the weight behind the name. One night, as Anthony sat with him in the back of a dim cafe, Benny said what had been weighing on him for months. "You've done more in 6 months than any of these other families have done in 6 years." Anthony sipped his coffee. "Doesn't matter if they don't fear it." "They don't need to fear it," Benny said. "They need to respect it." Anthony looked out the window. "Respect dies faster than fear these days." Benny shook his head. "Only when it's not backed by something real." Anthony leaned back. "It's always backed by blood. That hasn't changed. Benny smiled for the first time in a while. You Persicos really don't believe in soft endings, do you? Anthony didn't smile back, just said, we don't believe in forgetting. But it wasn't all wins. One of his guys, a kid named Tony Bosco, got clipped in April 2020, shot twice outside a strip mall in Diker Heights. No witnesses, no cameras, no message left behind. It wasn't just a hit, it was a test. The feds came snooping immediately. Anthony played it cool, attended the wake, said nothing, hugged the mother, kissed the ring of the local priest, didn't make a show. But the next week, the man suspected, a soldier from a rival outfit in Jersey, was pulled over in a routine traffic stop. He was never seen again. No charges filed, no body found. The press called it another mob mystery. Anthony called it balance. That summer, the whispers reached the commission. Not officially, not yet, but loud enough to echo through cigar smoke and corner tables. There's a Persico pulling strings again. Some welcomed it. The older bosses, still clinging to what used to be, saw it as a resurrection. Others didn't like it. Power coming from nowhere made them nervous, and a young Don with Carmine's blood, but none of his enemies. That made him dangerous. Offers for sit-downs came in, meetings in Jersey and Yonkers, even upstate. Anthony declined most, but one he accepted. It was with Vinny Grasso, a quiet but sharp-acting captain from the Genovese family. A man who never raised his voice but never lost a war either. They met in a restaurant with no name, no cameras, and no outsiders. Grasso poured the wine himself. I heard you're rebuilding, he said. I'm continuing, Anthony replied. Grasso smiled. Careful, there's always a difference. Anthony nodded. Not if the foundation never cracked. Grasso sipped. Your grandfather was a stone, never bent. Anthony leaned forward. I don't plan to bend either, but I don't need enemies. Not unless someone starts digging in my yard. Grasso set his glass down. We're not looking for war. Neither am I, Anthony said, and in that silence an understanding was made. Not peace, not alliance, but respect. And in this life, that was a currency more valuable than gold. The peace didn't last. Peace never does in this life. Not when power is shifting. Not when a name like Persico is getting spoken again in rooms that thought it was buried. It was late 2020. The city had changed. Lockdowns had made the streets quieter, but behind closed doors, business was humming. Online gambling had exploded. Guys weren't breaking knees anymore. They were breaking firewalls, hijacking accounts, skimming crypto. And for the first time in years, the families were making real money again. Anthony had moved fast. He'd brought in 2 tech-savvy associates, one of them a college dropout who used to code poker bots, set them up under an LLC. Ran digital sports betting through dummy servers overseas. The feds didn't know where to start. It was too new, too fast, too clean. The envelopes started getting thicker. Respect followed. But so did the problems. Because when you're rising, even quietly, people notice. And some people don't like it. The first sign came from the inside. A guy named Salvatore Sally Knox Calabresi, low-level, mouthy old school, started making noise. He wasn't a threat, not directly. But he had ties to the Bananos and thought that made him bulletproof. He'd been around long enough to remember the Persico name at its lowest. He didn't like seeing it rise again. He's just a kid, Sally told a table full of drinkers one night, wears plain suits, talks like a priest. This ain't the movies. You don't resurrect a dead family just 'cause your last name's heavy, someone told Anthony. Of course they did. In this life, every word is carried, and every word has a price. Benny Searcy heard it too. He called Anthony in the middle of the night. You hear what Sally said? I did, Anthony replied, calm as always. You want me to handle it? No, Anthony said. Let him run his mouth. Let's see who listens. Because that's what mattered. Not who talked, but who listened. Anthony was playing the long game, but by spring, Sally wasn't just talking. He was undermining. Started pulling guys off Anthony's numbers crew. Started promising them easier money, less heat, more independence. That was betrayal. Not for the money, but for the disrespect. Anthony didn't need soldiers who looked at two bosses and weighed which one gave them a better return. That wasn't Cosa Nostra. That was a startup. The old code demanded action. So, he acted. One night in May, Sally Knox got into his car after dinner and found a note on his dashboard. "You're already dead. You just haven't laid down yet." Sally skipped town the next morning, fled to upstate New York, stayed in a motel for 2 weeks, sent feelers out to the Bananos asking for protection. They denied him, because even they knew Carmine Persico's blood wasn't something you spit on and walk away from. Sally turned himself in on an old gun charge, took a plea. Anything to get locked away where bullets couldn't reach him. He was gone, but the message stayed. Loyalty wasn't optional. Not long after, the attention came. Federal, press, buzz. They started calling Anthony the Quiet Don. Articles popped up. Who's the young Persico behind the digital mob? Photos were taken, grainy shots of him leaving restaurants, shaking hands, stepping into town cars. Anthony didn't like it. He didn't want a brand. He wanted control. The spotlight was poison. Benny called him again. "You gotta watch your step. They're putting your name back in the air." "I know. They're gonna try to trap you. Make a case, even if it's weak." "I know. You ready for that?" Anthony paused. "I was born for it." But pressure was building, not just from the feds, from within. Because now that the Colombo name was breathing again, others wanted a piece. Guys who stayed silent during the dead years were suddenly talking like they'd never left. Soldiers who hadn't kicked up in 5 years were now demanding representation. Worse, some of them wanted votes. That's not how it worked. Anthony didn't run a democracy, he ran a legacy. The Colombo family had one line of succession, and his name was carved into it by blood. He met with them anyway, in a closed room in Bay Ridge. 6 captains, each older than him, some with gray in their hair, others with bodies too soft to fight anymore. They didn't shout, but they didn't hide their meaning. "You're doing good work," one said. "No one denies that. But there's been no formal vote. You were never made boss." Anthony nodded. "Let them talk." "You got blood, sure," another added. "But this is a new era. We need new leadership, a vote, a structure." Anthony stared at the table. When they finished, he stood. "Gentlemen," he said, "I appreciate you showing your cards." Then he walked out. 3 days later, one of the captains, Angelo Russo, was picked up by the IRS. Tax evasion. 10 years of unfiled paperwork suddenly surfaced in a neat, airtight file. 2 weeks after that, another captain, Tommy Valente, got caught in a prostitution sting. His name was leaked to the press. His face hit every local paper in Brooklyn. No arrests were made on Anthony's side, but the captains fell silent. No more talk of votes, no more whispers of structure. Because in this life, power doesn't ask for permission, it announces itself in silence. Then came the sit-down, the real one, with the commission. Not all the families, not officially, but enough of the big names to matter. It happened in a warehouse office outside Yonkers. No recordings, no phones, just men, old and young, sitting in a circle like a council of wolves. Anthony showed up last, wore a simple coat, no entourage. He didn't speak first. He waited. It was Vinnie Grasso, the same Genovese captain from a year earlier, who broke the silence. "You've got their attention now," he said. "I didn't ask for it," Anthony replied. "No," said another, "but you earned it." Another voice added, "You bring structure, you bring discipline, we'll let you stand. But you bring heat, bring war, we let you fall." Anthony nodded. "I don't want your blessing," he said, "just your respect, and a little room to build." "And what are you building?" "A future that doesn't depend on the past, but never forgets it." They liked that. The meeting ended with no vote, no title. But Anthony walked out of there recognized, and in this life, that meant more than any crown. Back in Brooklyn, the streets felt different, not safe, they never would be, but stable. For the first time in over a decade, the Colombo family had order. Money flowed again. Loyalty meant something again. The name Persico wasn't just history. It was present, still sharp, still feared, still standing. That night, Anthony sat in his grandfather's old chair. Benny was there, watching quietly. "You did it," he said. Anthony didn't smile. "No," he replied. "I just reminded them who we were." Benny nodded. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "You ever think about how it ends?" Anthony looked down at his hands. "Every night." And Anthony leaned back. "I just want to make sure when it does, it ends on my terms, not theirs." Time had a way of testing every man. It didn't always come with bullets or betrayal. Sometimes it just came in the quiet hours, when the street was asleep and the echoes in your head grew louder than anything outside. Anthony Persico had everything he thought he wanted: power, respect, fear. The Colombo family was stable again, not a powerhouse, not what it used to be, but structured, disciplined, profitable. The captains fell in line, the street taxes came in, the digital rackets grew faster than anyone predicted. Envelopes were fat again. Contractors were paying on time. Even a few unions long thought lost had returned to the fold. But with power came paranoia. Not the loud, obvious kind, the quiet kind. The kind that creeps in when you're sitting alone in a dark room and you start wondering who's really loyal and who's just waiting. It started with a phone call at 2:47 a.m. Anthony never answered his phone that late, unless it was blood. This time, it was Marco Lanza, one of his more trusted collectors. Nervous voice, low whisper. "Boss, we might have a problem." Anthony sat up, still calm. "What kind?" "There's a Fed. Not just any Fed. One that's been meeting with a guy from our Jersey operation." Anthony didn't speak for a second. He hated that word. Fed. It didn't mean law. It meant rats, informants, surveillance, indictments, the things that rotted the old world from the inside out. "Who's the guy?" Marco hesitated. "We think it's Enzo." Anthony didn't flinch. Enzo Falcone, 33, quiet, slick, ran one of the newer gambling apps in Jersey that Anthony had helped build. Smart kid, made good money, never flashed it, but if he was meeting with the feds, it meant one of two things. Either Enzo was caught and trying to make a deal, or Enzo had already flipped. Anthony stood, walked to the window of his apartment, looked out over the East River. The skyline blinked with soft light. So much had changed, but some things, the rules, the weight of betrayal, had not. "Keep eyes on him," Anthony said. "No pressure, no panic. I want to know where he eats, who he talks to, when he breathes." Marco agreed and hung up. Anthony stood at that window for another 10 minutes. Then he turned to the table, took out an old notebook, leather-bound, weathered with time, and wrote one name in it: Enzo. He didn't put a line through it, not yet. 2 weeks passed. Enzo kept working like nothing was wrong. Took meetings, ran money, kept up appearances, but Marco's guys tracked him every hour. On the 15th day, they followed him to a parking lot outside a seafood restaurant in Hoboken. He met with 2 suits, black coats, bad posture, that Fed posture, the kind that says, "We don't belong here, but we don't care." One of them handed Enzo a manila envelope. Enzo opened it, nodded, handed back a flash drive. Photos were taken, license plates recorded. That was all Anthony needed. He didn't make the call, didn't write the order, didn't ask for a vote. He just nodded to Marco. And Enzo was gone before the weekend, found in the back seat of a burned-out Lincoln, teeth removed, hands gone, no ID, just ash and a memory. The message wasn't just for Enzo, it was for anyone watching. After that, things tightened up again. More discipline, more loyalty, less noise. But something else had changed. Anthony had changed. He felt it in his chest. Not pain, not weakness, just weight. He wasn't afraid. That wasn't the word. He'd already made peace with death. That came with the job. But now he was starting to feel what his grandfather must have felt toward the end. That quiet emptiness that comes after every move, every decision, every death. And no satisfaction. The power was real. But it was also lonely. He couldn't trust most of the people around him, couldn't talk openly, couldn't drop his guard, couldn't date a woman without wondering if she was a plant, couldn't drink at a bar without scanning every face, couldn't sleep more than 4 hours without checking his phone. He missed his mother's calls 3 times in a row. He hadn't visited his brother in over a year. He hadn't laughed, not really, since the day Sally Knox vanished. The empire was alive. But Anthony? He was just awake, not living, just operating, like a machine built to protect something already dead. Benny noticed it too. They were sitting in silence one night, an old habit now. Same table, same bitter coffee, same background noise of spoons clinking. "You look like you ain't here anymore," Benny said. Anthony didn't look up. "I'm always here." "That's the problem," Benny muttered. "You never leave." Anthony said nothing. "You build it back," Benny added. "Maybe not to what it was, but enough. You don't gotta keep feeding it?" Anthony stared into his cup. "If I stop feeding it, it feeds on me." Benny lit a cigarette. "That's the thing about thrones made of ghosts. Sooner or later they ask for your name too." Anthony didn't respond. He didn't have to. They both knew. Weeks passed. The family stayed stable. Business was good. No heat, no arrests. Even the commission kept its distance, respecting what Anthony had done. But behind the calm, the machine inside Anthony kept turning. Not just watching, not just planning, preparing for what he didn't know. He only knew that men like him, men who wore the weight of their name like a knife tucked behind the ribs, didn't get peace. And he wasn't looking for it. He wasn't afraid of falling. He was just making sure that if he did, he fell with his eyes open. The day Anthony turned 40, no one said a word about it. No cake, no toasts, no party. That's the thing about birthdays in the life. They don't matter once you're in it this deep. The only numbers that count are how many years you've stayed alive, how many people you've buried, and how long your name still carries fear. He sat in his private office above a concrete supply yard in Gravesend. Dim light, clean desk. One old photo on the wall, not of his grandfather, not of his father, but of a map of Brooklyn from 1979. He used to look at it when he was a kid, memorized the streets before he ever walked them, knew the blocks where bodies got dumped, knew which corners belonged to which crews. It was more than geography. It was scripture. Now it felt like a eulogy. Things had changed. Anthony had changed. He wasn't tired exactly, just slowed. Not in action, but in feeling. He couldn't remember the last time he looked at a piece of paper and felt excited by a number. Couldn't remember the last time he cracked a real smile. Couldn't remember the last time he forgot, even for 5 minutes, that someone, somewhere, was planning to take it all from him. That's the part no one talks about when they talk about power. It doesn't sit. It stalks. That night, Benny came by. The old man was thinner now, paler. His steps were slower. His suits fit loose, like the world didn't hold him tight anymore. But his mind, still sharp, still razor precise. He dropped into the chair across from Anthony, poured himself a glass of something dark, and said, "You know, Carmine didn't even make it to 79. Anthony raised an eyebrow. "You bringing up ghosts again?" Benny smirked. "Just saying. You build an empire, you end up building your own tomb, too." Anthony didn't reply. Benny lit a cigarette, hands shaking slightly. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to get out." "Out of what?" "This, all of it. The street, the talks, the collecting. I'm tired." Anthony stared at him. "You leave, you die," he said flatly. "Then maybe I'm ready." Silence stretched between them. Benny sipped again. "You ever think about it?" "About what?" "Getting out." Anthony gave the smallest shake of the head. "There's no out for men like us." "That's a lie," Benny said. "It's a rule." Benny crushed his cigarette. "Then maybe the rules are the lie." Anthony looked away. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest. Not fear, not guilt, doubt. He didn't say it, but he felt it. And Benny saw it in his eyes. The next morning, word came down that the feds were sniffing around again. Not strong, not direct, but active. An old associate, recently paroled, had been seen talking to a federal task force in Manhattan. No charges, no paperwork, just heat. The kind that doesn't come from fire, just the smell of smoke. Anthony met with his lawyer that afternoon. It was quiet, controlled. The lawyer, a man Anthony trusted more than most, sat across from him and placed a thin folder on the table. "They're not moving yet," he said, "but they're watching. They've got names, they've got locations. They're not aiming for a RICO yet, but it's coming." Anthony opened the folder. Inside were transcripts, surveillance photos, traffic stops, and a name, one he didn't expect. Dino Perino, his own guy, mid-level, trusted. Worked the docks, low-key, smart, now under a watch list. Anthony leaned back, closed the folder. "How long?" 3 months, maybe more. Depends if they flip anyone." Anthony nodded slowly. "What's the chance Dino's talking?" The lawyer hesitated. "He's quiet, but he's soft." Anthony sighed. "Then he's a liability." No anger, no panic, just the facts. That night, he didn't make a call. He didn't send anyone to watch Dino, didn't order a tail. He just sat in his apartment, lights low, staring out at the East River again. Same view Carmine once stared at, same city, same storm, and the same end, waiting quietly down the line. Anthony poured a drink, not to celebrate, not to unwind, but because for the first time, he wondered, was he becoming his grandfather? Not in strength, not in discipline, but in inevitability. Was the throne built too high? Had the name become a crown of knives? He thought about Dino, about what it would cost to bury him, about who would notice, about who would be next. Because in this life, there's always a next. 3 days later, Dino disappeared. No body, no call, no bodyguards, vanished. And everyone knew what that meant. There was no fear, no outrage, just a silence that tightened the air around the entire Colombo network. Anthony said nothing. He never confirmed it. But every man under him moved a little faster after that, paid a little sooner, stood a little straighter, and that was enough, but the weight was there. In his chest, in his head, in the way he moved, it wasn't regret. Anthony didn't believe in regret. It was the cost of keeping the name alive, the cost of rebuilding something that maybe, just maybe, should have stayed buried. He sat alone more now, ate alone, walked alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. He knew what this life meant now, not just the power, but the price. He wasn't just ruling. He was trading years of his life for every dollar, every nod, every ounce of fear. And one day, they'd come. The feds, or a bullet, or both. They'd say it was justice. They'd call him a criminal. They'd try to reduce the legacy of 3 generations down to one mugshot and a closing argument. And maybe they'd win. But until then, he would stay sharp, stay ready. And when it came, he wouldn't beg, wouldn't fold. Because no matter how this ended, the name Persico would not die with silence. The summer of 2021 came in heavy. The heat lingered over the city like a judgment, the kind of thick, unmoving heat that made even strong men feel slow, sticky, tired. And for Anthony Persico, it came with a new kind of suffocation, not from the streets, not from the feds, from inside. Business was good, better than it had been in years. The digital rackets were paying off like gold. 2 gambling networks under his flag were moving money faster than the old loan shark crews ever could. A trucking union had just quietly elected a Colombo-connected rep, giving them leverage on routes from Jersey to the Bronx. Even the commission, notoriously cautious, had started giving Anthony more deference. Not formally, not in public, but the nods were there. The respect. The silent agreement that he had done what no one thought possible. He made the Persico name matter again. And yet, the more he won, the less it felt like winning. He sat alone more now, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know who to sit with anymore. There was Benny, of course, but Benny had slowed down. The old man rarely left his house in Staten Island. Diabetes, bad legs, thinning voice, they still talked, still shared coffee once a week. But even that felt more like ritual than brotherhood. The rest, soldiers, captains, associates, earners, they respected him, obeyed him, but none of them knew him. and none of them wanted to, because the deeper you climb in this life, the more your face disappears, until all that's left is your name. And names don't get friends. Names get targets. He started having dreams again, not the kind with screaming or blood, the quiet ones, where he walked into a room and no one saw him, where he called out and no one answered, where he bled and no one cared. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, staring at the ceiling, breathing hard like someone had been sitting on his chest. The city would still be there outside the window, same blinking skyline, same whisper of sirens in the distance, but something inside him felt thinner, like every decision carved a piece off him. In late July, the FBI made their first real move, nothing direct, but they executed a search warrant on one of the shell companies tied to the Colombo trucking interests. Computers taken. 2 junior employees questioned. No arrests, just enough to make people nervous. Anthony got the call within minutes. His response? Simple. Let them take the scraps. We already moved the bones. It was true. He'd shifted all sensitive operations weeks earlier. Call it instinct. Or maybe just that voice he'd inherited, the one Carmine had too, that said, "They're coming. Move." Still, it was a reminder. The streets might have forgotten, but the feds hadn't. They didn't care about the past. They wanted the next Persico scalp. After that, the crews got twitchy. One of his captains, Joey Vasallo, called him 2 days later. "Word is, the Bureau's got a guy inside," Joey said. "An earner, low level, nothing major yet, but close enough to make things complicated." Anthony sat in silence on the call. He didn't ask who the guy was, didn't panic. Instead, he asked, "Does he know what happens to people who complicate things?" Joey hesitated. "He should." Anthony hung up. That same week, Anthony stopped carrying a phone. Not out of paranoia, out of discipline. He reverted back to the old ways. Face-to-face meetings only, no electronics in the room, no names spoken out loud unless the door was closed and the blinds drawn. It wasn't just about avoiding wiretaps, it was about control. He started visiting crews personally again, quietly, no entourage, no advance calls. He'd just show up, step into a back room, stand behind a man counting cash, and wait until the room went silent. It worked better than violence, because presence does what blood can't. But with every step forward, Anthony felt something slipping. He couldn't put his finger on it. Not trust. He didn't trust anyone. Not loyalty. That was always conditional. It was himself. He'd built so much, rebuilt so much, carried a name through the dirt, through time, through blood. But the man behind the name, he didn't know what was left of him anymore. Was he just a shell wearing his grandfather's crown? Was he building a future, or just preserving a grave? One night, he drove alone to Bay Ridge. No escort, no backup, just him. He parked across from an old social club, now a vape shop. It used to belong to one of Carmine's captains. Anthony remembered walking past it as a kid, holding his father's hand, watching the made men smoke and drink and laugh like gods behind stained glass. Now, it was gone. The new world didn't need kings. It needed algorithms and ad revenue. He watched the kids coming and going from the vape shop, all tattoos and Bluetooth earbuds, wearing sneakers that cost more than his first car. They didn't know what stood here before, didn't care. And Anthony knew then, deep in his gut, that he was building a kingdom for ghosts. 2 days later, he called Benny. "I need to talk," he said. They met at the old cafe. Same table, same coffee, same 2 chairs that hadn't been replaced in 20 years. Benny looked worse, gray skin, thin wrists, but his eyes still carried fire. Anthony sat in silence for a while, then finally spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore." Benny didn't blink. "That's how you know you're still human," Anthony exhaled. "I didn't build this for me. I built it for the name, for the blood, for the code." And Anthony looked down at his hands. "It's still not enough," Benny nodded. "You thought it would be?" "I thought I'd feel something. Like it mattered." Benny sipped his drink. It does matter, but not to the people you think. Anthony looked up. It only matters to the ones who are already dead. That night, Anthony walked home. No driver, no phone, just the city, buzzing, indifferent, alive. He passed restaurants filled with laughter, kids smoking in doorways, couples fighting over parking spaces. None of them knew him, and maybe that was the point. He ruled a world they didn't see, and he had become invisible to the world that moved on. That was the cost. That was the truth. He wasn't building an empire. He was guarding a tomb, and he was the last man left outside it, keeping watch, cold, awake, and alone. Night dripped through the city's veins like a dark confession. In the late summer, the streets weren't blazing with fire, just hummed with something sharper. Anticipation, a quiet, electric kind of tension, the kind that only name recognition, especially a power-earned name, can cultivate. Anthony Persico felt that hum more every day. He'd rebuilt something most thought dead, structure, discipline, revenue, but each win shoved him deeper into a corner he couldn't leave. He'd reached power, but the victory tasted hollow. The cost? Not bodies, not indictments, not rivals. It was loss. Loss of self. He stood on the terrace of his modest Brooklyn brownstone, lights of the harbor winking in the distance. A soft breeze carried distant sirens, music from a corner shop, laughter. He closed his eyes. Somewhere past that blur of noise, he'd found clarity. The ledger was full. The captains were quiet. The commission had deferred to him even without a formal title. But at 48, the age his own father nearly never reached, he felt a void forming inside. Power didn't weigh him down. Meaning did. That night, Benny arrived by train, slow, pulling smoke in the windows. He walked in with that familiar old detachment, eyes tired, hands steady. They sat across from each other in the dim cafe. Cigarette smoke circled them. "I feel distant," Anthony said without looking up. Benny just nodded, understanding in silence. "Power isn't what it used to be," Anthony continued. "They don't fear us. They just use us. My name's become a passcode." "So make them remember your presence," Benny said softly. Anthony closed his eyes. "Yeah, at what cost?" The next day passed like a fog. Anthony made the rounds. Silent visits to crews, business fronts, digital operations. No phones, no paperwork. Just presence. Amber streetlights flickered overhead. Parks echoed distant laughter and sirens. He went home late, sat with drink in hand, thinking of his grandfather behind prison bars, still calling the shots through invisible threads. Did he ever feel this quiet? Maybe. Maybe he knew too. A few nights later, the call came. Low voice, formal. A name dropped. Justice depth, surveillance, inquiry, pressure rising. Anthony's response was calm. Let them look, but they'll find history. And history doesn't talk. He hung up and stared at the dark river outside. The real war had just begun. Weeks passed without a body, without a bullet. But the air shifted. Men moved like shadows. Conversations were coded, eyes averted in the streets. Anthony felt the presence of unseen threats. Not the feds, they were secondary. The true threat was failed loyalty. Not who would betray him, but who forgot why the name even mattered. He worried now not just for business, but for memory. Would the real Persico story survive the next generation? Would it matter? He called a meeting, not with the captains, with the earners, the clients, the unseen operators, men with clean-cut suits and currently clean records. He laid out a vision, not of power, but of purpose. Proceeds reinvested into community businesses, jobs for families, not recruiters. Legacy preceded by support, not fear. They didn't know how to process it, but some nodded. Some started feeling something again, pride. The heavy buzz didn't go away, it sharpened, feds tightening, competitors probing. And within the remnant families, distant cousins, the next generation, eyes turning back to the foundations he'd rebuilt. One afternoon, he met with a contact from the commission, not in a club, a warehouse, or a diner. in a church parking lot. Sacred ground for a deal stained with sin. The message? They saw him. They respected him. They let him stand. Still no titles. Still, in this life, that meant everything. But at home, Anthony slept less. Dreams returned, not violent, empty. He walked through rooms where no one was listening. Voices he never heard faded. He realized he'd built an empire of ghosts, and now those ghosts were all he was left to keep. One morning, Benny didn't show for coffee. A doctor's note. Health reasons. Anthony grabbed his coat. He went to Benny's quiet house off the train tracks, knocked on the door, saw the old man sitting on the porch, hands shaky but the eyes still fierce. "You okay?" Anthony asked. "I'm near the end," Benny said, "but someone's got to keep this going right." Anthony nodded. "You're not alone." Benny squeezed his hand. "It matters, kid, but it's got to mean more than fear." Anthony stared at him. He'd lost himself in power. Now he had to find what mattered again. That afternoon, he walked through Bay Ridge, past the old club that used to be the social center of Persico operations. It was now a daycare. Kids' laughter spilled into the street. A mother looked up, fearless, turning the corner. In that moment, Anthony felt the name shift from tool to story, not of violence, of survival, and he hoped renewal. That night, he sat back on his terrace, city lights flickering around him, sirens, laughter, distant music. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "This is why it matters." Because people say power is addictive, but Anthony realized legacy is the true burden. Those who earned it can hold it, but those who lose sight of why, they vanish. And he wasn't ready to vanish yet. The first sign was small. Anthony Persico forgot his driver's name. He'd been using the same kid for 3 years. Good kid, quiet, never asked questions, never played games. The kind of earner you didn't worry about. One night after a late sit-down in Queens, the kid pulled up to the curb and Anthony stepped in, sliding into the back seat. "Thanks, silence." The kid didn't say anything, just nodded. But Anthony felt it, that sharp jolt in his stomach. A piece of his memory missing, slipping like a coin into a drain. He didn't say anything on the ride home, just stared out the window as Brooklyn passed, neon signs flickering over shuttered businesses, and kids on dirt bikes zipping through red lights like they were invincible. In the life, nothing was invincible. Not power, not loyalty, not memory. Anthony didn't panic. He wasn't the panicking type. But he started noticing more of it. Names, dates, pieces of conversations. It wasn't like he was going senile. He could still recall federal case numbers, blood oaths, the location of every dollar across 5 dummy corporations. He could still walk into a room and know who had a problem before they opened their mouth. But something in him was wearing down. He'd spent decades absorbing pressure, death, betrayal, strategy, secrets. And now that he was standing still, it was all echoing back. He thought of Carmine. His grandfather didn't go out in a hail of bullets. He died slowly, quietly, in a federal prison infirmary, body giving out, heart collapsing under the weight of 100 decisions made with a cold face and hot blood. Anthony had thought he was different. But now, he wasn't so sure. In the street, things were holding, just barely. Crews were paying, rivals were silent. The commission wasn't interfering. The money flowed. But something else was surfacing. Tension, not from outside, from within. A new generation of earners, young, fast, tech-smart, were growing more confident. They respected the name, yes, they feared the story. But they didn't understand the code. They wanted flash, influence. They watched gangster movies like tutorials and treated extortion like branding. Anthony watched them like a father watches a son who's too stupid to know how much danger he's in. One of them, Mikey Swipe Costello, started making noise. Not outright disrespect, just arrogance. He skipped envelopes, showed up late to meetings, started showing his face at influencer parties, posting cryptic messages on private social media accounts. Nothing overt, just reckless. Anthony brought him in, back room, No audience, no soldiers, just the two of them and a room full of weight. "You forgot who you're representing," Anthony said. Mikey sat across from him, legs spread like he thought he owned the floor. "I'm making more money than anyone under 40. You think the commission gives a shit about how I do it?" Anthony said nothing. Mikey continued. "This life's changing. We either evolve or we become stories they stop telling." Anthony leaned forward. "I'd rather be a story they fear than a name they forget." The silence held. Mikey looked away. That was all Anthony needed to see. The kid didn't get it. He'd never last. But Anthony didn't make a move. Not yet. He needed the kid's revenue stream, his contacts. But he also knew time would eat him. The only question was whether it would happen before or after he embarrassed the family. That night, Anthony had dinner with Benny. The old man looked frailer than ever. His left hand trembled just holding the fork. "You ever think about who carries it after you?" Benny asked. Anthony chewed slowly, swallowed. "Every day." "You got a name," Benny said, "but names fade. Even Persico. You don't pass it to someone strong, someone loyal. This whole thing folds in a generation." Anthony didn't respond. He'd thought about it. A lot. But who? The captains were too old. The young ones were too soft. There were no Persicos left in the game. Not by blood. Only him. "You know what Carmine said to me once?" Benny added. He said, "We don't build empires. We delay collapse." Anthony nodded. "I believe it." "But you," Benny said, "you could pass it forward. Make it last. Maybe not forever, but longer than it should." Anthony wiped his mouth with a napkin. "And what if there's no one left worth passing it to?" Benny leaned back. "Then we die like kings of ash." The idea sat with Anthony for weeks. Succession. Legacy wasn't what you built. It was who you gave it to. He started watching more closely. Meetings, payments, posture, silence. Who asked questions, who kept records, who remembered small details. And slowly, one name began to surface. Vincent Russo. Quiet, mid-30s, third-generation street blood. Never flashy, never late. Kept clean books. Made his crew loyal not with threats, but with consistency. Anthony called him in. Back room. No soldiers, no desk between them. "Tell me why you're still in this life," Anthony asked. Vincent looked him dead in the eye. "Because I believe structure keeps men honest, even dishonest ones." Anthony stared at him. "You ever want to run things?" Vincent didn't blink. "I want to protect what was built. That's not the same thing." Anthony nodded. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Stick close," he said. "Watch everything. Learn what I don't say." Vincent understood. The meeting ended with a handshake. And for the first time in months, Anthony felt like maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't die with him. But the world had other plans. That fall, 2 indictments dropped. Old charges, nothing connected directly to Anthony. But they came close. A shell company tied to a trucking union. A digital affiliate traced to an associate in Jersey. No arrests, just subpoenas, headlines, whispers. The feds were heating up again. Anthony didn't react outwardly, but inside, the old rhythm kicked in. Shut down the outer circles, clean the books, double vet every mouth. He didn't sleep more than 3 hours at a time, not from fear, from calculation. Every hour, his mind spun strategies, who they'd flip first, who they'd pressure, who would talk, and who needed to disappear before they got the chance. One morning, his driver found him asleep in the back seat. First time that had ever happened. He woke with a jolt, hand on his belt like he was expecting a hit. "Sorry," Anthony mumbled. The driver didn't answer, just kept driving. That afternoon, Anthony called his doctor. Quiet, discreet. They ran tests, scans, blood work. The diagnosis, early onset neural degeneration. Not fatal, not fast, but progressive. Memory lapses, mood irregularities, fatigue. The doctor gave him medication, therapy options, advice. Anthony listened in silence, then folded the papers, tucked them in his coat, and walked out without a word. He drove to the waterfront, stared out at the same river his grandfather once ruled from prison. He whispered one sentence. "You built a cage. I filled it with ghosts. He didn't tell anyone, not Benny, not Vincent, not even his lawyer. Instead, he worked harder, pushed meetings, cleaned house, disbanded 2 loose crews, froze 3 accounts. Every day he tested his own memory. Every night he waited for more dreams. They didn't come, only silence. And in that silence he made a decision. He would not die in chains. He would not fade in bed. He would not be remembered as the boss who forgot where he put his gun. If the end came, it would be on his terms. The way Carmine never got. The way Benny never asked for. The way only men who built kingdoms understood. The last winter Anthony Persico would ever see came in quiet. No snowstorm, no blacked-out news headline, just cold that sat in the bones and didn't leave. The city seemed slower, grayer. Like it too was waiting for something to end. He could feel it now. Not fear, not failure, just the weight of completion, the kind that doesn't come with applause or gratitude, just stillness. And in that stillness, silence. That's how real legacies die. Not with noise, but with memory. The last few months his steps had gotten slower, his appetite weaker. The pills helped, but only when he remembered to take them. And some mornings, he didn't. He kept it from Vincent, from Benny, from everyone. He still sat at the head of the table, still signed off on major moves, still spoke when he needed to, still walked into rooms that turned silent the moment his face appeared. But behind the dark suits, behind the firm stare, his mind was starting to slip. It was like pieces of himself were fading into corners he couldn't reach anymore. One night, he stared at a photograph for 10 minutes before realizing he didn't know who was in it. It was him and his brother, dead 20 years. He folded the photo, put it back in the drawer, didn't speak of it again. The feds were circling again, not with evidence but with pressure. A grand jury was forming. The subpoena list was long, too long. His name wasn't on it, but he knew that didn't matter. They wouldn't come at him directly. They'd come at the name, the network, the bones he'd rebuilt from ash. He watched Vincent take more responsibility. He didn't push it, just allowed it to happen. Vincent knew how to move, understood structure, didn't chase attention, didn't make noise. Anthony had chosen well. Still, that didn't mean it was easy. Letting go isn't natural for men who were born to carry weight. Benny was dying now. For real this time. Hospice bed, oxygen, thin skin stretched over tired bones. Anthony visited him late one night. No entourage, no guards, just him. He sat by the bed pouring water into a cracked cup, holding it to Benny's lips. "You were always quiet," Benny rasped, voice barely above a whisper. "But I saw it in your eyes. You weren't building for you. You were building to finish something." Anthony said nothing. "You did." Benny looked over at him. "You ever think about how it ends?" "All the time," Anthony whispered. And Anthony looked down at the floor. "It's already ending." He left that night without saying goodbye. Benny died 2 days later. No funeral, no wake, just an envelope, cash to the family, and a name that didn't need to be spoken. That's how it's done. The last of the old guard was gone. And now Anthony knew. He was the final one, the last Persico the street would fear. And soon, not even that. One morning, he forgot his own address, walked 3 blocks past his apartment, stood at the corner staring at a door he didn't recognize. A dog barked behind it. He turned and walked home without saying a word to anyone. He knew then it was close, not prison, not betrayal. The real end. The one you don't see coming until your mind leaves before your body does. He sat in his office that night, closed the blinds, locked the doors, pulled out a notepad. No emotion, no shaking hands, just focus. He wrote down every account, every contact, every fallback plan. And at the bottom of the last page, he wrote, "Let the name die clean. If they ask, we were ghosts all along." He burned the page in a coffee tin, watched it turn to ash. No backups, no copies, no loose ends. Then, for the first time in nearly 20 years, he poured himself a full glass of bourbon and drank it straight. No ice, no water, no guilt. The next morning, he made one call. to Vincent. "Come see me, alone." Vincent arrived within an hour. Anthony didn't sit behind the desk this time. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You know what this is, don't you?" Anthony asked. Vincent nodded. "You're handing it off." Anthony turned. "I'm not giving you power. I'm giving you a cage, a throne with no cushion, a name that buys fear but eats peace." Vincent didn't speak. "If you take this," Anthony continued, "you never get out. You don't get to love like a normal man. You don't get to sleep deep. You don't get to trust anybody." Vincent said, "I know." Anthony stared into him. "Do you?" Vincent didn't blink. "Yes." Anthony walked to him, reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, one name, one account number, one sentence. "If it ever burns, this is the last fire." He handed it to Vincent. "Use it once, and never again." Vincent nodded. "And you?" Anthony smiled barely. "I'm going to forget what day it is." That night, Anthony sat alone on his terrace. Same view, same city, same cold wind crawling in from the river. He thought of Carmine, not the legend, the man, the one who never got to see this, the one who ruled from a cage, who died alone with a steel ceiling over his head and guards watching him fade. Anthony had made sure that wouldn't happen to him. No cells, no trials, no confessions, only exit, and the exit was now. The next morning, the city moved like any other day. Cabs honked, subways howled, newspapers printed, children fought on playgrounds. Anthony Persico didn't come out of his apartment. When Vincent arrived hours later, the door was unlocked. No note, no blood, no sign of struggle, just a coffee mug in the sink, a picture of Brooklyn on the wall, and a folded coat on the chair, pocket empty. The Persico name was never spoken aloud again. No funeral, no wake, no headline. Just one whispered truth, passed from mouth to mouth among the streets. He walked out without a sound and took the weight with him.